hello and good morning, everyone, to all the participants from Singapore as well as Australia. In case you're wondering, I'm actually at home right now in Toronto, where the local time is 10 p.m. So after this talk, I will be crashing. As Jacob has mentioned, I'm actually a professor at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, but I do hold a joint appointment at JCU with the Singapore campus. I'm really honored to kick off the Professorial lecture series to commemorate JCU's 50th anniversary. For those of you guys who are not affiliated with JCU and you're thinking of either attending or sending your kids to JCU, I highly recommend it. It is ranked in the top 2% of the world's universities. I was supposed to deliver this professorial talk in person in Singapore, and I would have really enjoyed interacting with all of you guys personally in person. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, I couldn't travel, and I guess most of you guys couldn't either be in the physical office space as well. So that really leaves us with the Zoom session. I hope it works out well. We will have Q&As. I will be asking some questions of you all as well. It's either through a poll or a chat. So if all of you guys can just log in to or pull up your chat function, maybe you can type in your name and tell us where you're from. And of course, we'll do a shout out to you. I couldn't see you, but Jacob, who is moderating the session, will do a quick shout out. And of course, as I'm doing this presentation, I will have a few questions for you. I encourage you guys to also respond, interact with myself by giving us the response. And at the end, I will not tell you which question I will be asking, but in one of those questions, we actually have a surprise where I will be sending you a book based on my presentation today. So Jacob at the end will announce the winner. So make sure you respond and participate and tell us who you are. All right, so I'm gonna get Vinay to help me pull up my presentation. Vinay, are you still with us? All right, thanks for your patience. Can everybody see my PowerPoint presentation right now? So if you could just, perfect, thank you. All right, apologize for the technical delay there. Just a quick show of hands. Obviously, I can't see you, but you can actually raise your hands to the Zoom chat function. So a few questions to get us started off. How many of you guys have kids 30 and under? Raise your hands. Okay, I see a whole bunch of people raising hands. Wonderful. How many of you ever told them that they were special and could change the world? All right, I see hands going up. Okay, you can do anything you want if you put your minds to it. That's what you tell your kids. And you give them or encourage them to use an iPhone, an iPad, and Alexa. Be careful with that because Alexa can help them do their homework. If you don't believe me, just Google this on YouTube. They probably figured it out already. All right, and you push your children to achieve the best. And if they didn't, you give them a reward anyway. So even if they came in last, here's a ribbon. I'll take you out to ice cream. Now you have raised them, you manage them. Some of you guys may have seen this video clip. It's about 15 minutes long, Simon Sinek, who actually asked the millennial question. And what exactly is the millennial question? The question that he asked is, why are millennials so tough to manage? And what he had said was, millennials are entitled, narcissistic, self-interested, and unfocused. Now, is there any truth to this? You probably read a lot of popular press about millennials. And of course, what I try to do here is to present the research findings that we have conducted over the last few years. So, part of the question that Simon Sinek had raised was, how did we end up with this highly narcissistic generation? And why are they so tough to manage? So a colleague of mine, Jean Twenge, had, before I even get there, here are some headlines that you might have seen, and this is from The Guardian. Parents who praise children too much may encourage narcissism, say study. And then of course, CNN, back home in the US, parents may be to be blamed for narcissistic kids. And even in the Netherlands, the headline says, "We don't want to raise a generation of divas." Dutch research suggests that we're making our children, turning our children into narcissistic twits. And this isn't really good. So a colleague of mine, Jean Twangy at San Diego State University, had actually stumbled upon data that's collected across 50 states from high school students here in the US. And of course, you can see that spans quite a long period of time. But just to give you an excerpt here, between 1980 to 2005, so not in the too recent past, you see that these are narcissistic scores of high school students, and they have been inching up over the past 25 years. And this is pretty scary. In fact, as you can see from the bottom there, 2/3 or 65% of college students now score above average on narcissism, 30% more than back in the 1980s. So, you know, in psychology, we will be quite concerned because once you hit a high narcissistic level, it becomes clinical. What's interesting, of course, is there's an anomaly in this data set in the US. For instance, in the state of California, the scores were not very high. And this might be of interest to those of you guys from Singapore. What we see here is that in the state of California, there are a lot of Asian students, as you know. So what happens, of course, with Asian style parenting is your parents always tell you that you're never good enough. I remember it sort of coming home with a math exam where I scored 65%, sorry, 95% rather, 65. I think my parents would murder me. And of course, I got a smack on the head, and you know, and I was pretty proud of myself with my 95%. And my mom said, why isn't this 100%, right? So that's the difference, and that explains the lower scores in California. A lot of you guys may know Amy Chua, who's author of The Tiger Mom, you know, Asian parenting style. So my advice is don't spare the rod. So this is the narcissistic score. Now, there's a difference between self-esteem and narcissism. It's great to sort of parent your kids to have high self-esteem, because self-esteem simply says you're as good as everybody else. And that's really important for the personal development. Narcissism, on the other hand, refers to telling your kids that they are better than everybody else. So this is where we run into problems, especially with the millennial generation. All right, so to help put things into perspective, or to give you some context, a lot of studies across generations are conducted mainly in the US. So most researchers have used roughly the same brackets or time periods that we have seen based on American data. I'll quickly walk over this, and I'll give you some context with respect to Singapore and Australia as well. So as you know, anybody who was born prior to 1945 or 44 are veterans. Very few of them are around, especially those who were born at the turn of the century. And of course, right after that, we have a fairly sort of large bracket, a cohort here that we have named baby boomers, folks who are born after 1945 or 46. Essentially what happened here was the kids came back from war, and they made up for lost time. So what they did was they started producing a lot of children. So that lasted for a good period of time, up until 1960 in the US. Now, here's the first question I have for you guys. In Canada, the baby boom generation actually lasted till 1965. And I'll give you a few moments to think through why there's an extra 5 years of baby boom in Canada. Now, moving next to it is, of course, Gen Xers, people like myself who were born between 1961 to 1980. So I'm at the tail end of the Gen Xer sort of cohort here. So in Canada, because the baby boom generation lasted for an extra 5 years, Gen Xers really begin around 1966 in Canada. So that we have an extra 5 year of boom. And of course, Gen Xers are a lot shorter. And then of course, that ends around 1980. And around 1981, that's where we have the Gen Ys or Millennials. And that lasts for a good 15 years till 1995. There's a lot of confusion with Gen Ys or Millennials, as we call them. Gen Ys are not children of Gen Xers. They are children of baby boomers. I would be too young to actually have children at that time. So I've put up the faces of 3 presidents. I will not put up the current president because he is not a Gen Y millennial. Now, what you see here for Gen Y is AOC. That's the name that she goes by, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She is a freshman congresswoman from the state of New York. She was just elected 2 years ago. So now, anybody can tell me why there's an extra 5 years of baby boom in Canada? Jacob, do you have any responses from the chat?
No responses yet, my friend.
Okay, so let me give you the response right now. In case you have been guessing, but you have not actually had the time to send us your response. Now, Canada is very slow in many regards, and that includes the introduction of the birth control pill. So because of the fact that the birth control pill was only introduced after 1964, 65, we had an extra 5 years of boom. What it really meant was that the Americans did not stop having sex. So they continue having fun, and yet they didn't have that extra 5 years of boom. So there you go. All right, so moving along, for those of you guys who are in Singapore, I'm pegging your current prime minister, the previous prime minister, as well as I believe he's the deputy prime minister at the moment, Swee Keat-hing, who is a Gen Xer. And then of course, the youngest politician I can find in Singapore is Nicole Seah. She is truly a millennial. And for the audience who are participating in Australia, here are your Australian prime ministers. Scott Morrison is a Gen Xer. He is not a millennial. Now, I do have a question again for all of you guys who are listening in. At the moment, we actually have a prime minister who is a millennial born in 1980. Without Googling, can you type in your response and let us know who you guess might be a millennial prime minister? Jacob, if you have responses coming in, let us know.
Will do. Am I able to have a guess myself?
All right, go for it.
Well, I'm speaking on behalf of New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern?
Yes, she is indeed a millennial. She was born in 1980. A lot of people had actually, or might have guessed, Justin Trudeau. Unfortunately, he was born in 1971. He's not that young. So Jacinda Ardern is an exemplary prime minister who is also a millennial. Maybe it's time for millennials to run the nation.
We've got some coming in from the audience, Eddie. We've got the Norwegian prime minister from Shelley. I'm unsure of her name, but I do know that she's young. You aware of the Norwegian prime minister?
I know she's fairly young. I haven't had a chance to look her up, so I believe you that she would potentially might be a millennial too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving along. So as researchers, we're really interested in, what are millennials, how are they different, and why should we care? So what I'm trying to do is to answer 3 questions here. How is the present generation millennials different? What sort of career expectations, work attitudes, and work values that they might have, and how that might have shifted over across different generations, and what are the implications for organizations and employers? So to answer these questions, I'll first put up what Simon Sinek had said earlier. There are 5 common stereotypes of millennials. I'll blitz through this fairly quickly, and I'll allow for some questions at the end of the 5 common stereotypes, and I'll launch into the studies I've conducted and share my findings with the audience here. All right, so as you know, millennials want work-life balance, they want good pay and benefits, they want rapid advancement, they want interesting work, and they want to change the world. And at the end of the day, they want to make a difference. So in other words, they want all of those, and they want them all now. How true is that? So if we're to read the Time magazine or to log into social media, we find out a lot of these things are relatively true. I'll share some of those findings with you here, and then we'll go ahead and see if any of them actually hold true. So why do millennials want work-life balance? So a lot of them have seen their booming parents work really hard. And notwithstanding, we saw the GFC global financial crisis around 2007 and 8, where there was a lot of downsizing. A lot of their parents were out of work. Some of them saw September 11. Now, Gen Z have not seen September 11 yet because they were not born when September 11 took place in 2011. So, but for those who were born, prior to that, the millennials, they have actually seen the horror, and what they tend to value is life. They prefer making a life over making a living. So that's their mantra. What we did find from a workplace perspective is that they're more likely to negotiate the terms of work. Instead of negotiating work-life balance up front, they're more likely to demand it throughout their careers. So that's one of the things that we may have seen. All right, second part, they want good pay and benefits. In fact, there's a think tank in the US, it's Corporate Leadership Council, that compared Gen Ys with Gen Xers, and they found, and can look at the scores here, Gen Ys, millennials, actually value base pay the most. And this is pretty scary. So what we see here is that there's a strong emphasis on financial rewards, right? There's an expectation of good pay and benefits. This is not surprising. If you were to go back to a bit of a history here, so what we have seen is that a lot of millennials were raised in relatively middle-class households, especially in North America. What it really means is that the baby boomers have worked really hard to be able to provide a good life to their children. So as a result of that, there's this sort of sense of entitlement. Part of it's the high self-esteem parenting style. And as a result of that, we have this problem, the problem of ability performance nexus. I often get this when it comes down to returning grades in class term papers. I have students that come up to me, Professor Ng, I sacrifice sleep, I sacrifice sports, I sacrifice parties with my friends to get this term paper out to you. And why is that a B? It should be an A because I've spent 20 hours on this paper. So there's an inability to sort of connect performance with ability. As long as they put in the effort, they expect to sort of reap the benefit, right? So this is one of the issues that we've seen in the classroom. So there's this strong sense of entitlement. What's interesting, of course, is given the fact that most are raised in a relatively middle-class environment, they don't really completely understand the value of money here. So money to them is actually an indicator of how well they're doing, right? So with social media and their friends, they like to say, oh, I'm making $60,000 a year. So money really is an indicator of success, really more than their actual performance, indicator of their performance. The third, of course, is the prospect for rapid advancement. They have the supersized expectations. They're really impatient to succeed. Anecdotal evidence that I have heard, oftentimes when you hire, and I used to work at the bank, I spent 7.5 years with the TD Bank Financial Group. And what I was in group HR, and what we often hear is that MBAs that we hire are really impatient to be successful. They were wondering how come they don't get raises and promotions just after 6 months. Of course, sort of the whole paying your dues no longer exists. And they are not shy to actually move to different employers who can provide them with better opportunities. So there's sort of the notion of, disloyalty among the millennials. And we'll see later on how true that actually is. Of course, they want meaningful work experiences. Nowadays, they actually look at the company's value and mission statements, their corporate social responsibility records. At the end of the day, you often find millennials asking the employers or interviewing employers, what do they do to help society in general? So it's profit with a purpose. That's what we've been seeing quite a bit. They only want high impact assignments where they can actually make a difference. The reports that come in from both the Toronto and New York top law firms, where millennial associates were actually refusing work because to them, this isn't high impact or meaningful cases for them to actually take on. So this is quite a difference from what we have heard, where associates tend to fight for cases, right? So there's a study conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers that asks millennials, how many of you guys would consider leaving your employer if they no longer meet your corporate or your CSR needs? So I've picked up a few select countries here from the Americas. So as you can see, Argentina and US and Brazil, over 90% of them would actually leave the employer. Even in Asia, 2/3 of Indian students say that they would actually, millennials would actually leave the employer if they feel that the employer no longer meets their CSR expectations. And then the last stereotype that we have is they want a nurturing work environment. All of us in business schools now teach teamwork. So we have them work in group projects. That's sort of, how work is organized increasingly. And of course, as a result of that, you find that there's greater socialization in school, and that also carries into the workplace as well. So they tend to emphasize the social aspects of work quite a bit. In fact, what they do is after wanting high pay, they actually rate manager quality to be the next most important consideration when accepting employment. So here's a study that was done comparing, sort of different cohorts, older boomers, younger boomers, Gen Xers, younger Gen Xers, and millennials. And you'll find that 2/3 of millennials actually say they want to socialize with their friends at work. And that's an important thing for them. All right, so those are the 5 general stereotypes that we hear fairly often from popular press and the media. So we want to go out and see how much of this is actually true. So as a social science researcher, we tend to use larger scale studies as opposed to relying on anecdotes or case studies. We use psychometrically sound or proven questionnaires and what we refer to as evidence-based management. So we don't just use anecdotal observations. But what's important here is to actually point out to you whenever you sort of hear reports about generalizations on a particular generation, you got to figure out whether it's an aging effect, a period effect, or a cohort effect, right? So let me quickly run that through to you. So aging effect essentially refers to life cycles. So no matter where you are in the world, most teenagers, they play computer games, they go to school, they like angry music. So that's the general trend. And of course, once they hit their 20s, they finish, college or university, they are looking for their first job, launch their first career. Some might even start a family. And then of course, once they get into the 30s and 40s, they start maintaining the careers and do the career progression. And by the time they get to the 60s, they sort of begin to slow down. And that's what we call the retirement phase, according to Super's career staging theory. But that's, and of course, by the time you hit the 60s, they're much more likely to prefer classical music rather than angry music, right? But that's not to say that a 60-something-year-old wouldn't want angry music or a 15-year-old who wouldn't like classical music. So there are exceptions to that, but by and large, we use the term on average. Now, of course, there are period effects. Period effects are really important because, especially during our foundation years, because in order for you to be able to generalize across a generation, they must have some sort of a common experience. And that's particularly important during the foundation of building years. So especially when you're in your teens, what you hear at the dining table while you're having dinner with your parents, what occurs around you. So during my time, the space shuttle explosion was a really big deal. For the millennials, September 11 was a really big deal. So was the global financial crisis because that impacted sort of their worldview, right? When they were forming these worldviews. Internet was really born while the millennials were growing up. But Generation Z, who is the present generation, are the ones who were born after the internet was founded. So there's a big of a difference. During my time, my favorite idol was Madonna. And of course for millennials, it was Lady Gaga. But I bet you most Generation Zs don't even know who Lady Gaga is. And of course, the defining event for most Gen Z, the generations at core, it would be COVID-19 in terms of how it affected their lives, their school, and how they actually have to stay home. Now, that's period effect. So that would have an important sort of impact on, your worldview, especially when all these events occur during the foundation years. Now, of course, there's core effect, which is truly what we refer to as generational effects, right? Most millennials would have a middle class upbringing. They tend to see a higher divorce rate among their parents who are baby boomers. They tend to be raised with higher self-esteem. So those are the things that we can actually synthesize out of the studies that we do. So one of the things that's important to do is to actually look at longitudinal time series data as opposed to just a sectional data. So that sort of explain a lot of findings that you might see out there. All right, so moving along, this is a study that's that's collected by 3 major consulting firms, Decode, Brainstorm, and Universum. There's about 28,000 roughly students that they have actually surveyed. The data was actually conducted in Canada, but because of the fact that we were interested primarily with the millennials in order to answer the questions that I've asked earlier, so we actually filtered it down to 23,000 students, representing roughly 85% of the total sample. There's a 60-40 split here with respect to gender. So in Canada, and that's also true in the US, we tend to have more women in universities and colleges than men do. Roughly a third of students that were in the study have some sort of work experience. So co-op is very popular. They would study a term, go and work for a term, and then study a term. And of course, we were interested in the performance. So this is self-report. So we would expect millennials to all report to be top performers, but we actually found a really good distribution. The average GPA would be great. From the sample that we have would be a B. And that's a good indicator to us that the data set is relatively reliable. All right, so we want to look at the career expectations, advancement expectations, pay expectations, and what kind of work values that they aspire. And sharing this data with you, and here's the first poll or first question. So we asked them, how many of the millennials would be willing to accept a less than ideal job to start their career? So I'm posing the question to all of you. You can all post it onto the chat and Jacob can read them out loud. What proportion of the millennials you think who are graduating university would be willing to accept a less than ideal job? Just throw out a percentage.
Thanks,
Jacob,
Eddy.
do you have any numbers coming
Eddy.
in?
I've just got some numbers coming in now. 40% from Rohan, Mariana 10%, Denise 20%, Anna 40%, Paxton 30%, Cassandra 20%, Betsy 20%.
Okay.
So there's a good range here. Peter 60%, 50%.
Okay, I like that range. Thank you. All right, let me just share some findings with you here. So 71% of the millennials who are graduating colleges and universities are actually willing to accept a less than ideal job. And of course, the balance of it, hang on, let me just move my own slide a little bit, are unwilling. But what's interesting, of course, is as you know, women were more likely than men to accept a less than ideal job. So in other words, they have less of a leverage. Students with work experience, co-op, that I've mentioned earlier, was 15% less likely to accept. In other words, they can afford to be choosier because having some sort of work experience, supports or strengthens their resume or their CV. And of course, willingness to accept a less than ideal job increased by 9% for every year of study. So as they progress from freshman to sophomore, to junior to senior, the willingness to accept a less than ideal job goes up. This just demonstrates the desperation when you need a job. And lastly, students with a stronger GPA are less willing to accept a less than ideal job. Of course, the better students tend to be choosier, so that makes sense. All right, so here's the second question. We talked about loyalty earlier. Millennials have a lot of this, express a lot of disloyalty in part because if they don't find the work to be meaningful or challenging, they're much more likely to actually work for a different employer. So oops, I did not mean to show you that, but now that you have seen it, how many of the millennials are willing to spend, their whole career with a single employer? So as you can see, 50% of them are actually willing to spend the entire career with one single employer. So you can't quite say that millennials are not loyal. And of course, and this is fair, a trait say that they do not know, and of course the balance would say that they do not. And if you break down the findings, once again, you will see that women were less likely than men to want to work for a single employer. I think they factor in the career interruption with raising a family. The likelihood would decrease for each year of study. So as you know, when they progress from, through the university careers, they actually become smarter and they are much more wiser to want to work for different employers. And of course, with GPA, stronger students, of course, would have different options and have different career aspirations. So they're less willing to work for one employer only. Okay, pay expectations. Now, again, I'm gonna share this with you guys. I'm gonna poll you guys again. So these are students who are graduating university. what is their initial salary expectation, and what is their salary expectations 5 years out. I would put out the first number. So when they graduate university, they expect to make say $43,000 on average. So my question to you guys is, what would their salary expectations be 5 years out? So you can all put in your answers, and Jacob would share them with us.
Happy to do so, Eddie. $100,000, Femi. $80,000 from Denise, 100K from Rohan, 80 to 100 Cassandra, 70, 70, 75,000. Well, the answers are coming in quick here. 90, 74,000, 100,000. Some very optimistic people.
You guys are very, very ambitious too. All right, so 5 years out, the millennials expect to make $70,000. That's a 63% increase. Now, in Canada, Statistics Canada actually polls students or surveys students every year, every graduating class. And we know that the average starting salary for somebody with a bachelor's degree is roughly $45,000. Now, 5 years out, let's say the average merit increase is 3%. Over 5 years, we are looking at a merit increase of 15% in total. But according to the students, the millennials, they expect a 63% increase. In actual fact, they actually end up making 18% more. So Stats can track this cohorts 5 years out. They did make roughly 18% more, but not to the tune of $63,000. So certainly we do have very high salary expectations among the millennials, especially of themselves, right? So again, some interesting stats for you. Women expect to make less. Their starting salaries are roughly $6,000 less. And of course, GPA and years of study would impact your expectation as well. Those with work experience, again, 1/3 of the students tend to have co-op experience, and they tend to have higher salary expectations. Advancement expectations. I'll put the slide out for you guys because of time. Now, you'll notice that the average time for promotion is actually 15 months. So millennials expect their very first promotion after being on a job for 15 months. When I used to work at the bank, you don't get a promotion until you have a performance appraisal of a B+ for 2 years in a row. And very few people actually get that. So 15 months is certainly very ambitious. And you can see 2/3 expect a promotion within the first 18 months, a year and a half into their job. Women have a lesser expectation compared to men. And of course, a year of study impacts your promotion expectations as well. Now, what's a killer is that we were trying to predict, trying to find what predicts this advancement expectation. We thought grades might be, but we find that in fact, the B students were the ones having the highest expectations, not the A students. So there's no relationship with GPA at all. So this is quite concerning. I put up some figures earlier with respect to gender, and I know a lot of folks here have both sons and daughters. And one of the key, and a lot of my research revolves around gender diversity. So I want to look at, why is there a sort of gender pay gap that we haven't been able to close, especially with very strong legislation in North America. So in Canada, we actually have pay equity. We also have equal pay for work of equal value. But notwithstanding that, we still have a pretty persistent pay gap, and it tends to widen as you move up the corporate ladder. So we know that women actually experience what's called a glass ceiling. But when men find themselves in a numerical minority position, so if they go into teaching or social work, they tend to ride what's called a glass escalator. So they become supervisors and managers, right? So what we have here is that they tend to enjoy a structural advantage. So we tend to see a lot of discrimination that's in place, but that doesn't really explain, or that partially explains the pay gap. But what's really concerning, or the hypothesis that we have here, is that pay gap is actually predetermined before the millennials even go into the workforce. Now, we know with the millennials, they have a lot of expectations for equality, equal distribution of housework. There's a greater number of women in professional work, and yet this pay gap seems to be there. So what we wanted to find out if there's an expectation difference while they are still in the pipeline. All right, so here's the data. Using the same salary data that you saw earlier, we broke it out by arts and social sciences, business, as well as science and engineering, so the STEM disciplines. So no surprise, STEM disciplines tend to pay more, followed by business, and arts and social science degrees tend to pay a little bit less. Now I'll put up some, I won't poll you on this, but I want you to look at the patterns. Once I pull up those bar graphs, I want you to locate 3 patterns and see if you can actually spot the gap that actually exists here. So if you're arts and social sciences, you make $38,000 from graduation, in the business school, 44, and if you're in STEM disciplines, up to $50,000. And of course, it's lower for women. So this is the initial salary expectations that men and women have based on the disciplines. Now, 5 years out, again, the 3 disciplines, and then the division between men and women. Men in arts and social sciences expect to make more, businesses even more, and STEM just slightly less, because 5 years out, most folks tend to go into management and the salary will be slightly higher. All right, if you look at the salary expectations among women 5 years out across the 3 disciplines, again, they're lower. So I'll wait you guys out. So have a look at the bar charts that you see in front of you. There are really 3 distinct patterns that you might be able to observe. Can you kind of point them out? Once you have noticed a pattern, you might want to sort of put it into the chat and Jacob would read them out.
Thanks, Eddy. I'll just wait for some responses. Could you perhaps repeat the question, Eddy? Lower than, women are lower than men?
Yep, so as you can see across, so I'm asking the audience to see if they can find 3 patterns here from the bar graphs that I've just put up. One of it clearly is true. So there's pay gap across, between men and women across all disciplines, whether it's initial starting salary or 5 years out. Any other patterns you might see?
Well, I've got another good answer from Denise. Arts lower across initial and 5-year periods.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as you can see in male-dominated fields, for instance, science, STEM, science and engineering, the pay gap is actually higher, both initially and 5 years out.
We've got another one, gender bias from Abhishek. Thanks, Abhishek. Another one, Eli Lee. Women always have lower expectations of salary. Point 1. Point 2, arts and social sciences are always paid less.
Right. So it goes back to the point that I made earlier, right? So so women tend to congregate in arts and social sciences, social workers, teachers. So as a result, the pay gap is there. But when you look at male-dominated fields, for instance, in business or particularly in STEM disciplines, the pay gap is actually higher. And then the third one I'll mention to you is women do ride or benefit from the male structural advantage. So when women actually go into STEM disciplines, their pay is actually higher than if they had actually stayed in arts or social science. So those are the 3 patterns. So you see them here. I won't repeat them. Of course, we also went out to ask the millennials, both men and women, in terms of what is important to you. What are your career priorities, right? So men are much more likely to say financial success, attain management status, get into managerial positions, so they want to start your own business. Women are more likely to say work-life balance or contribute to society. And this is what we see here. Every time a millennial says, I want financial success, they make another $2,000. Every time they say, I want to become a manager, they make an extra $1,200. And every time they say they want to start their own business, they make an extra $2,600. Women, though, every time they say they want work-life balance, they take an $1,100 penalty. And every time they say, I want to contribute to society, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a social worker, they take a $2,100 penalty. So career priorities actually also impact their career, the compensation that we see, the pay gap. The third study that I want to share with you would be career expectations. So this is a much small sample. The sample is small because in this case, we actually did interviews. So based on 3,000, we have roughly 900 millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers. It was very difficult for us to locate matures who are still working. Nonetheless, we have 300 of them, pretty even gender split. So what we want to find out here is how did their careers change would the work values actually change and whether they have actually met their career expectations with respect to their earnings, the advancement, and their recognition. I won't go through the whole theoretical reasoning behind this, but historically we all have traditional careers, but now we have modern careers where we define success really differently. And of course, it's also referred to as boundaryless careers. We tend to move organizations, move geographical boundaries, and we change jobs, even mid-careers more frequently. So what you see, of course, is interview data. We had 11 matures, 22 boomers, 40 Gen Xers, and 32 millennials. And we coded them in 5-year bands. So when you're in your 20s, you tend to explore your careers. So when you're in your 30s, you establish your career. And then, of course, once you hit, 40s, 50s, you're in your career maintenance stage, and past 65, at least in North America, which that's our traditional or natural retirement age, you tend to sort of disengage from your work and you begin to wind down your career. All right, so here's another question for all of you guys. This is a poll question. Now, so when we did the study, the oldest millennial at that point in time was only roughly about 30 years old. So in order to facilitate a consistent comparison across the different generations, we asked each of the 4 generations, how many job changes have they had by the time they hit 30 years old? So I think Vinay just pulled up a poll here. So how many job changes do you think matures have had before they hit 30 years old? You have 4 options: 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 5 to 10. So vote now. Same question for baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, and then I'll show you the findings.
Thanks, Eddie. I will update you as the results, that they're coming in thick and fast. I'll wait.
Right.
I'll wait till they sort of become clear.
All right, let me show you what the survey says. So main job changes that matures have had by the time they hit 30. Oops. 2, baby boomers. 3, Gen Xers, people like myself. 3-ish, not quite 4. And for millennials, a whopping 6 plus. So as we can see, millennials tend to change jobs a lot more frequently, despite the fact that 50% of them actually say they are willing to stay with one employer, right? But this is just mean job changes. The second question I have is how many of them have made career moves? A career move is something that can refer to a lateral move, promotion, or demotion, although that is somewhat unlikely. So is this a poll question, Vinay? I cannot remember. This might not be a poll question. So let me just share the findings with you. Again, let me just move this
Eddie, just to
away.
let you know, Vinay is able to share the results of the poll with everyone as well. So I don't need to go through the individual results.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so mean career moves, whether it's a lateral, promotion, or demotion. So it could mean any of those, but the bulk of it would generally be promotion or lateral move. Boomers, very similar. Matures, very similar to job changes. Again, very similar for boomers, as well as Gen Xers, folks like myself. And again, we have millennials making a lot more career moves than previous generations. So that's a pretty interesting finding. All right, work attributes. So earlier on, I said, how work values change. And one of the questions we asked was we actually asked the 4 different generations to actually tell us what their work values are, what's really important to them on a scale of 1 to 5. Here I'm just presenting the results of one generation, would be the millennials. As you can see, the things that they value most: advancement opportunities, good people to work with, good people to report to, going back to some of the stereotypes that I've mentioned earlier. And then comes the next band. And lastly, things that are not important to them: travel, commitment to diversity, being a leader in the field, social impact. So at the end of the day, despite the fact that millennials say they want to solve world hunger or they want world peace, that actually falls quite far down. And this is a fairly large sample size, right? Almost 30,000 millennials that we have here. But moving along, what you actually, oops, in the wrong direction. But what we actually wanted to do is to look and see which ones are really important for which generation. So slicing the data slightly differently, we look at what are the strong work values for matures, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. So we can follow along. The very first sort of set of charts here will be impact, and matures score highest on impact. Do any of you guys know how old Queen Elizabeth is? She's in her 90s. I know that for sure. She belongs to the mature generation, and she actually defines what the sort of work ethic and etiquette that they have. To her, creating an impact is really important. And as a result, she's still there working. And poor Prince Charles, he's a senior citizen by now. And unfortunately, he's still not, hasn't really gotten to his main job yet, right? Because the mother, the queen, is still in that role, creating impact for herself. All right, then of course you have baby boomers, who are the next generation down. So you look at achievement here. So they score highest on achievement. So if you have got boomer parents, so my parents are actually baby boomers, the earlier end. And you'll find that what they wanted to do as achievement, don't forget, they were the ones that came back from the war. They created the world, they created demand, they created jobs, and of course they became very successful. So this whole achievement thing is really key to them. And even though most of them are of retirement age, in North America, we have actually done away with mandatory retirement. You still find a lot of boomers to continue working, not because they have the financial need, but because they want to have this sort of achievement mindset that they have. Gen Xers, folks like myself, work-life balance pops up as the #1 most important work value. The question that I have for you guys is, why would work-life balance be most important? There's a follow-up question to this. So you can start sending in your answers on the chat, and then if I can get Jacob to hold off telling us what those answers would be, that would be great. And then of course, with millennials, as you can see, achievement still ranks as #1, as you can see through the black graph bar here. All right, so of the 4 different generations, I believe this is a poll. So Vinay, can you pull up the poll? If you're not able to, you can all type it in chat. Now, of the 4 generations, matures, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, can you guys tell me which is the unhappiest generation? Now, this question is the one that will win you a book. So as you guys type in your answer, Jacob will randomly pick one of you guys with the right answer, and we will send you a book at the end of this talk.
Happy to give you the answers, Eddie. I'm not sure what the right answer might be, though.
Okay.
We've got a lot coming in. Zore, Millennials. Wen Liang, Generation X. Denise, Matures. Peter, Boomers. Shaz, Gen Y. Winita Tan, Gen X. Ruby, Gen X.
Okay, that's excellent. All right, so what's going to happen is we have all your responses on chat. And then, of course, Jacob, you can scroll back and then pick the winner based on the right answer after this. Yes. So let me tell you who is the unhappiest generation here. All right. Oops, I think I'm going backwards. All right, so we asked the same questions of the 4 generations in terms of their career satisfaction. How many of them felt that they met their earnings expectations, their advancement expectations, and their recognition expectations? So met expectations is actually a summation of those 3. And what you will see here is that without a doubt, Gen Xers actually are the unhappiest generation. As you can see by the orange bar, they score the lowest across the global index, as well as on all 3 sub-dimensions of it in terms of earnings, advancement, and recognition. So going back to the question that I had asked earlier, why are Gen Xers the unhappiest generation? You can type in your answers and then Jacob can read them out.
Just waiting for the answers to come in. Eddie, I can update you on the winner of the book from the previous question.
All right.
That winner is Paige Tan. Paige Tan, congratulations on your successful answer.
All right, Paige, what I'm going to ask you to do is after this presentation, if you can just hang on so that one of us could actually get your contact information so that we can actually mail the book out to you. And I'll tell you what book you'll be getting. All right, any responses to why Gen Xers would be the unhappiest generation.
I've got some answers here for you, Eddie. Firstly, from
Okay.
Anna, they feel they have had to go through more than others to get where they are now, feel that they have had to work a lot harder.
Okay, that's
Rohan,
actually pretty good.
yeah, Rohan, they worked harder and now they see Gen Y having an easier life. Eli's come in, higher expectations to succeed from boomer parents.
That is also true. All right. Now, this is it. If you want to follow statistics, what we are looking here is the sandwich generation. So folks like myself who are Gen Xers, we now have elderly parents. So we actually have parental care. A lot of us are also raising a family, which also means we have childcare. So we are sort of sandwiched in between. So we have work stress, we have stress that come from looking after our families as well as our parents. As you know, a lot of baby boomers are still in the workforce because they really enjoy working, which really means that they haven't really made space for Gen Xers to move up the corporate ladder. So what you see here, of course, is compared to the earlier generations, they haven't really have the same level of achievement or success. On top of it, you layer that on with, sort of looking after your parents as well as looking after your young family. They are the ones that report the lowest satisfaction. Hence, we tend to tell people we are the unhappiest generation. All right. And of course, some of you guys might have remembered watching this movie, Matthew McConaughey having to invite Sarah Jessica Parker back to his parents' basement in order for them to have a rendezvous. So that really depicts what a Gen Xer is like. All right, so Paige, so I have actually conducted this study through the generosity of the Canadian government. So it's a research team with myself, Sean Lyons, as well as Linda Schweitzer. And our research was actually funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And part of the research project that we did, we actually end up with 2 books. The first is Managing the New Workforce. It's actually a collection of studies. It includes a chapter on Singapore, how older workers view younger workers and how younger workers view older workers. There's also a chapter on Australia on millennials' attraction to public sector work. But the book I will send you is the book on the right, which really reflects or summarizes the presentation that you have heard today, generational career shifts, how matures baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials view work. So at the end of this presentation, please hang on. We'll get your contact information out and I will send a book out to you. All right, that's all I have for you guys. If you have any questions, we have, I apologize, we are running up to 11 o'clock because we had a slight technical delay up front. I'll hang on for a few minutes if you have any questions. If you have a question that couldn't be answered because we run out of time, I encourage you to either email myself, both emails work, my JCU Singapore email address or my work email address in the US. Thank you very much. I will turn this back to you, Jacob.
Thanks, Eddie. That was fantastic. A really interesting presentation. And got some questions that have come in during your talk, and I think I'll just address them in turn. First one came in from Abhishek, and it asks, how do you manage different levels of digital literacy and even adoption across multi-generational workforces?
All right. Thank you for that question, Abhishek. That's a really good question because what we do see is, especially with current work arrangements where we all work from home, technology has become increasingly critical. Oftentimes, there's a fault line between older workers and younger workers. Younger workers tend to be tech savvy, they know the latest technology, whereas older workers, of course, have not had the luxury of having technology as part of their work lives for a long period of time. So what we have often done in organizations is to pair them off. Remember how millennials have been overly parented at home? So what this really means is that when they go to work, they couldn't bring their parents with them, but they find instant mentorship, if you will, from older workers. And I did a study with workers over 55. We call them older workers, but the proper term to use now would be maturing workers. And what we found from the maturing workers, the chief complaint is that things have changed the way we do work. A lot of it's more ingrained. It's more ingrained in technology, especially with digital technology, and what we expect to see emerging will be AI, artificial intelligence. But the whole matching of an older worker with a younger worker really help, because from a younger worker's perspective, they tend to be able to benefit from, the life experience, sort of the life lessons that the parents would have imparted to them at home. But now that they're in a workplace, they're certainly looking for those. But from an older worker's perspective, they actually want to learn from younger workers. So having that sort of reverse mentoring relationship had proven to be effective from what we have seen.
Thanks, Eddy. Another question here for you. Some great questions coming in. This is from Denise. Are changing employee expectations ever tagged against improvements in quality of life and GDP, increasing access to education and health benefits, etc.?
That's a really good question as well. Certainly, one of the things that I had mentioned earlier in the study is the data is collected in Canada, and we have a relatively large middle class. It's very compressed. So some of the findings that you see that come out of this project reflect a relatively middle class upbringing. But quality of life, the GDP, any other sort of indicator of wealth, literacy, and socioeconomic status certainly impacts, your worldview, especially during your foundation years, right? So it's really important for us not to generalize the findings that we hear or read from the West, especially studies that were conducted in the US. When I raised the issue of why is there an extra 5-year boom in Canada, that's just an example of how context really matters. So for those of you guys who are doing research in Singapore or Australia, be mindful of how your national context matters. When I brought up the narcissistic scores across the 50 states in the US, that's another example of it, because California was an outlier, in part because there were a lot more Asian students in California, where parents always tell them you're not good enough, right? So that of course impacts things like self-esteem or narcissism scores. So going back to Dennis's question, yes, those quality of life indicators certainly matters when it comes down to sort of making any conclusion on any particular generation.
Thanks, Eddy. We really have got a lot of questions here. I hope we can try and get through them. This one's from Edwin. Millennials are often painted as entitled individuals. However, is it worth considering that every generation is more entitled than the last, especially when they observe areas for improvement from working practices of their elders?
So this is another chip complaint, right? So we always blame the generation that comes after us. So Matrice will blame the boomers, Gen Xers, and on and on. I think it's really important for us when we make social comparisons like that to actually look at the environment. So, up here in Canada, the baby boomers always say, during my time, I have to trek through, like 3 kilometers of snow to get to school, and that sort of a thing. But of course, we have modern conveniences and, technology, and that's changed. And what we do see is that with successive generations, they're experiencing increasing stress in the workplace, stress from, schoolwork, stress from parents, stress from competition, stress in getting a job. So I don't think it's fair to actually say that one generation had it better than the others. They each have their own challenges and difficulties. So when we look at the millennials, when they were launching their careers, they were experiencing the global financial crisis, right? So some of the results that you see here may in part reflect, the inability to actually get the jobs that they want right away, which explain some of the tempered salary expectations that we're seeing. Likewise with Gen Z that we're seeing right now, I mean, most are actually finishing universities and colleges, and here they are faced with a pandemic. It's hard to find a job, right? So you can't really say that one generation had it easier than the other. it all depends on, the major events that as a generation, they all experience together and what sort of challenges that they face.
Thanks, Eddy. Just quickly, another couple of questions. I do realize it is 11 p.m. Where Eddy is on Wednesday
Right.
night, so really respect the fact that he's staying here to answer these questions. One here from Betsy. Do you have advice or an opinion for millennials as a leader of older generations in a company? Thanks for your question, Betsy.
Sorry, I cut out there. Jacob, can I have you repeat the question to me again? I
Sure,
just heard Betsy. Yeah.
no problem. Do you have advice or an opinion for millennials as a leader of older generations in a company?
Okay. So we see a lot of inverse sort of management relationships here. So IBM had laid off a lot of pretty senior workers as part of their cost-cutting measures. I think that the experience might be similar for their subsidiaries out in the Far East. And what they had done was they actually ended up promoting a lot of millennials into management positions. And of course, they rehired a lot of the senior workers to come back to work for the millennials. And of course, you have this, what I call a fault line where two generations grade at each other. So there are a lot of stereotypes, that surround older workers, they're incapable of learning, they can adapt to new technology and that sort of a thing. One of the things that have worked really well in this respect is the reverse mentoring role that I've mentioned earlier with Abhishek's question. The other thing, of course, is to have a sense of humility. This is something that's much more ingrained in the East, where there's respect for the elders, in part because of the power distance. And it's much more of a challenge for the West, especially for those of us who are in North America. So what we have found, of course, is that over time, the socialization process necessarily entails that the younger worker would have to rely on older workers for the expertise, especially with the experience, in order for them to work together. So I think it's less of a challenge in the Far East than it would be so for us, sort of in North America.
Thanks, Eddy. Do you have time for one more question?
We'll take one more question and we'll have to call it a day or a night for me.
Thanks, Eddy. This one's from Shaz, and it relates to pay and salary. So it says she asks, pay and salary is related to the job scope and not necessarily to gender. This clearly shows there is a requirement for the change in organizational mind shift because there is already a bias or presumption on what one can do or cannot do.
That is an excellent question, Shaz. So in the ideal world, especially if you're in human resources, we expect to pay people not based on who they are, but rather based on the job that they do. And that is an important principle that we uphold. But in reality, of course, is when you are confronted, when you sort of have the experience of negotiating a first job offer, most often you tend to not be given a salary, but rather you negotiate for it. At least that's what we do fairly common in North America. And from that perspective, women tend to rely on other women, which is part of their networks, to gather salary information. So when other women who have been working out there already make less, they would pass on that information to the millennials who are going out to work. And as a result, that information that women receive when they negotiate their very first salary is already distorted. So that explains why the pipeline is so important. So when you negotiate your first salary, it's important for you to actually have perfect information. But if your networks are comprised of other women only who already make less, then of course you end up having discounted information and you negotiate less for yourself. So that's one factor that needs to be accounted for. The other thing, of course, is companies know that, and there are legislation that actually prevents employers from doing that. And up at the present time, a lot of employers are still going through compensation examination to look at pay gap and equal pay for work of equal value. The other part that comes with it is every time you take time off as part of a career interruption, you again take a discount in terms of your compensation, right? So when you come back to the workforce, you lose a few years. So your human capital, which is comprised of, knowledge, skills, and abilities, but also your experience, gets attenuated or shortened. So this gets magnified as you move up the career progression. You start off negotiating a lower salary, career interruptions, and because of the fact that you actually get fewer promotions because of all the interruptions, it actually has a multiplier effect, which explains why we still see a persistent pay gap, even though the principle is to pay everybody fairly and based on the job that they do.
Excellent. Thank you, Eddy. And I think we'll have to call it a day now. It's been a fantastic webinar, and I'd really like to thank Professor Eddy Ng for his time and his expertise in delivering what was a very interesting presentation. I'd also like to thank all of the people that came and attended today's webinar. It was very well received. With a large number of attendees. I'd like to also note that this is the first in a series of professorial webinars that will be held by JCU senior academics, and I would welcome all of you back to our next event. We will be letting you all know when that is, so please feel free to join in again.